Arc Worlds Publishing presents Guild of Tokens, Enforcer by John Auerbach. Read by Tavia Gilbert. Garrett was late. That wasn't anything out of the ordinary in Beatrice Taylor's experience. Her husband couldn't be counted on to be on time, even if he only had to walk across the street. But tonight was different. Tonight was their first wedding anniversary, and the snickers of the waitstaff at Joel Daniels were becoming too much for Beatrice to bear. She sighed and swirled the wine in her glass, a Pinot Noir from a winery in New Zealand that she and Garrett had visited on their honeymoon. Had a year passed already since they were two newlyweds off on an adventure halfway around the world? At the time, Beatrice had no illusions that the trip was going to accomplish what many years of dating had failed to do: turn their relationship into something more than a marriage of convenience. And she had been right. But for one night at least, maybe they could pretend they were a happily married couple. Beatrice glanced at her watch and wondered what was keeping Garrett. A last-minute call from his boss, asking him to move a text box up a quarter of an inch. Despite him being named vice president last year, she was still surprised at how much grunt work he was still expected to do. Maybe he'd gotten stuck in traffic? It wasn't yet holiday season, when hordes of tourists would descend on the city like barbarians at the gates, but Manhattan's roads still managed to slow to a crawl with the slightest bit of provocation. Or, and Beatrice hoped that tonight of all nights that this wasn't the reason, Garrett had decided to indulge in a bit of extracurricular activity with his newest side piece. It wouldn't be the first time that he had stood her up because he was off with some 23-year-old he met out at a bar. There was that time he failed to show up to Silver Linings Playbook, and when he crept into bed later that night, he had smelt of gin and cocoa by Chanel. Then there was his firm's summer outing 3 years ago, when one of the summer analysts could not stop making eyes at him. After the party, an inexplicable emergency had popped up, and wouldn't you know it, Garrett and the summer were the ones who had to rush back to the office to finish it. The brazenness of the whole thing had been so off-putting that when Garrett finally rolled into their apartment at 8 a.m. the next morning, she had nearly thrown a wine bottle at his head. Instead, she had tried to play the oblivious girlfriend card and offered to brew him a fresh cup of coffee, which he happily accepted. Except instead of half and half, Beatrice had added 3 drops of the truth serum she had been testing downtown. As he sipped the coffee, Beatrice had debated what to ask him. The serum only lasted so long, and she needed to be precise. How was she seemed too blunt, and Beatrice had no desire to know the actual details of Garrett's fornicating. How did the assignment go seemed too wishy-washy. For all she knew, there was actually an assignment, but maybe it had taken a total of 5 minutes. In the end, Beatrice had gone with the simple route. "Did you hook up with Laura yesterday?" she had asked him. "No," he had said, his voice monotone. "It was a few minutes past midnight." "Oh," she had replied. "Did you use protection, at least?" Beatrice was surprised that she had chosen that particular question, but she had later surmised that it was her subconscious deflecting her away from the query she wanted to ask. Why? "Yes," he had said. "Well, at least you're not a total idiot. Here, let me refill your coffee." She had practically ripped the mug from his hands and rushed into the kitchen, where she had poured in a smidge of coffee along with a different additive this time. Garrett's face had borne a look of confusion when she had returned and handed the mug back to him. Whether the look was from the line of questioning, or why he had answered truthfully, she would never know, because as soon as he swallowed the first sip, the memory serum had begun to work its alchemy. His pupils had dilated, and he stood there, without blinking, for more than a minute, before his mind had come back to him, only without the memory of the last 5 minutes. "Sorry, I was out all night, Bea. We needed to completely rework the financials of the breadstick manufacturer acquisition before the investment committee meeting this afternoon." "It's okay," she had said. "Hope you got it done in time." "We did. Laura was terrific. One of our best summers in a long time." "I'll bet she was." She had walked out of the kitchen before the urge to slap him across the face returned, and had spent the next hour sobbing silently in the bathroom. She bemoaned her lack of fortitude in fully confronting Garrett, but then had convinced herself that maybe, deep down, she didn't want to know why he had done it. If she didn't know the truth, she could pretend that it wasn't that Garrett found her lacking, that he wasn't just using her to placate his parents and their country club set. Maybe one day she would be able to recreate Rita's ink, and she could make him be faithful. Tonight she also wished she had some of that ink, if only to ensure that Garrett would actually show up. She took her phone out of her clutch and shook her head. He wasn't coming. Beatrice gulped down the rest of her wine and left the restaurant without another word. The dinner was already paid for, and she didn't need to suffer any more embarrassment at the hands of her husband tonight. As she exited the building, Beatrice began to raise her hand to hail a cab, but then stopped as she saw that the road just south had been blocked off with a string of construction barriers. Fine, she thought. She walked 1 block west as quickly as her heels would allow to find the east side of Broadway similarly blocked off. Beatrice threw up her arms in exasperation and began crossing the street for further points west before abruptly turning around and doubling back toward the restaurant. She had no desire to return so quickly to her empty apartment, to eat the top of her frozen wedding cake alone, to wait for Garrett to trudge in at some ungodly hour, to harp on him for being a complete and total jackass for standing her up without warning. Fortunately, the restaurant was located at the western edge of Central Park, and Beatrice quickly decided that a scenic walk home in the brisk autumn air would go a little ways towards salvaging a terrible first anniversary. The walking paths of the park were well lit but empty as Beatrice made her way into the interior of the urban wilderness. She didn't make it a habit of walking alone in the city at night, but she had enough confidence in her alchemy that she could handle an attempted mugging in a pinch without resorting to her trump card. That trump card, the Meadowblad, so named because it turned whoever was stabbed with it to stone, was unfortunately stashed away in her lab downtown. Not that she needed it, but it provided an extra air of reassurance that the handful of buffs in her bag did not. And of course there was the useless ring on her finger. Not the engagement ring, which might as well be a cubic zirconia for all the anguish her marriage had brought her. But the other ring, the simple silver ring slotted above the obscene diamond that contained a small purple stone. The stone that had held so much promise, but in the end Beatrice had not been able to unlock its secret. So there it sat as a reminder that she was still an infant alchemist compared to the might and knowledge of the guild. Some days, today especially, she wanted to walk into that jeweler's shop and throw both rings down on the counter and demand her money back. No, maybe the better idea would have been to skip her meeting with Doug on that muggy July afternoon 2 years ago. Doug was late. Ordinarily, Beatrice would not have cared, but the humidity was doing extreme damage to her just blown-out hair, and she didn't feel like wasting another $30 today getting it fixed back into place. Finally, she spotted her trainee sprinting down the block toward her table, as if he was trying to outrun the bulls in Pamplona. It made her think, just for a second, that something was genuinely wrong, that they were both in danger. But then he calmly walked into the outdoor cafe, his reddened face glistening with sweat, and Beatrice almost chewed him out for making her worry for no reason. "You're not that late," she said. "No need for the 100-meter dash." Doug hunched over in his seat, breathing heavily, before wiping the sweat off his brow. "So sorry, T. Needed to get here to tell you that—" T was short for Trinity, a Matrix reference she thought was funny at first, but she had begun to worry that Doug was beginning to actually believe she was Trinity, come to save him from the doldrums of the real world. "Tell me what?" "That your boyfriend is cheating on you." Beatrice stared at him blankly and took a long drag of her coffee. She was, of course, plainly aware that Garrett had begun another dalliance. All the familiar tells had recently resurfaced for the first time since she had interrogated Garrett the previous summer, but the identity of the new girl was something she hadn't sussed out yet. With his boss. It had been, in retrospect, a bad time to take a sip of coffee, for it took all of Beatrice's willpower and determination not to spit the contents of her mouth all over herself, and then pour the remaining contents of her cup on top of Doug's head. Instead, she forced herself to remain absolutely calm, as if Doug had merely informed her that it might rain later. She considered her trainee with a wary eye. How did he know all of this? It was clear now that he had started stalking her, and Beatrice was annoyed with herself at being so clueless to that fact, and that he was apparently infatuated with her and trying to be the white knight to save her from the horrible asshole she had shacked up with. Beatrice contemplated, just for a millisecond, giving in to Doug's transparent plan, but quickly decided that sleeping with him was not only a lousy choice for revenge sex, but also would open up a whole can of worms that she didn't want to deal with. Frankly, she wasn't sure she wanted to keep Doug on as a trainee if he was going to pull stunts like this. That was an issue for another day, though. Right now, she needed to put a stop to this particular affair, once and for all. 40 minutes later, in the elevator up to the 50th floor, Beatrice started to waver. It had seemed like a great idea initially, when she had run out of the coffee shop without saying a word to Doug, but now that she was moments away from striding angrily into Garrett's boss's office, she was having second thoughts. It wasn't like she was Rita Von Ash, with vials of command ink at her fingertips that would allow her to bend her adversaries to her will. If she had even a smidgen of that ink, all this would be over in a few seconds. No, her alchemy wasn't going to do her much good here. The few buffs she had managed to perfect were all about enhancement, and the truth and memory serum combo would be less than useless. She already knew the truth, and wasn't confident she could selectively wipe the memory of the affair from such an unwilling subject. The mind-linking apples might do the trick, except her supply had dwindled over the past several months, and getting Amelia to eat one would be a challenge in and of itself. That left only the Meadowblad, the most powerful and most impractical item in her arsenal. How she would love to see the look on Amelia's face as the stone streaks worked their way up her body until she was nothing but a statue. But the thing about turning someone to stone is that it's hard to move a 2-ton statue inconspicuously, let alone find a place to put it. The elevator doors finally opened on the 50th floor, but Beatrice quickly hit the lobby button before anyone could see her. As she descended, she kicked herself for being so impulsive. A direct confrontation was never going to be the right approach. And how could she have forgotten that she was not the only aggrieved party here? Beatrice had met Amelia's husband last December at the holiday party. He was a chemistry professor at Columbia, in his mid-50s, with an endearing British accent and a hearty disdain for his wife's profession. Beatrice wasn't sure how he and Amelia had ended up together. Maybe he had just needed a green card back in the day and had therefore given Amelia free rein to sleep around. If that was true, then merely confronting him with Amelia's unfaithfulness was going to go down in flames immediately. But maybe there was another way. She always did have a thing for men with accents. The night had grown chilly, and with half of the park still to traverse and her heels beginning to make her feet throb, Beatrice was beginning to regret her decision. She was also regretting the decision to wear the skimpy leopard print dress with black sequins in place of spots, the garment providing no barrier to the night air. Gray clouds dotted the sky, and the moon was barely a sliver, so the only illumination guiding her way home were the intermittent bulbs of the street lights that adorned the path, which had all begun to flicker for some reason. She quickened her pace, but the flickering continued, until one by one the lights began to disappear, and Beatrice was enveloped in darkness. "Hello," said a raspy voice from behind her, and Beatrice nearly toppled over before slowly turning around. She could barely make out the figure, who was standing several strides away from her, but he was large, that much was for sure. The man stepped forward a few paces, and Beatrice's pulse began to quicken. He was holding a small lighter in one hand, its glow providing the only source of light and illuminating the contours of his body. It wasn't just that the man was gigantic, with arms the size of tree trunks and broad shoulders that would make fitting through most doors problematic. No, what really made Beatrice start sweating was the smile on his face. It was a wicked, malicious, knowing smile, the kind worn by a person about to commit a heinous deed, and then walk away afterward, like nothing had happened. Beatrice took a deep breath and tried to compose herself. She was not the defenseless little girl that she once had been. She could do this. Besides, maybe he was just a fellow nighttime walker. "Hi," she said, slowly reaching her hand into her bag dangling at her side.
"Pleasant evening for a stroll, ain't it?"
said the man with a half-Cockney accent that nearly made Beatrice roll her eyes. "A bit too chilly for my taste," she said, her fingers now trying to determine which of the buffs was the one that she needed. She cursed herself for wrapping them all in identical plastic. If she grabbed the wrong one, she wouldn't get a chance to correct her mistake.
"Your man run out on you tonight, of all nights? Probably just as well. Seemed like a git."
A smirk formed on the thug's face, and Beatrice's eyes widened. "Don't know what you're talking about. I'm just trying to walk home." Her courage was flailing along with her fingers, which couldn't seem to grasp any of the buffs. She didn't want to look down into her purse in case the man thought she was pulling out a weapon and made a move first.
Sure. Wouldn't want to delay you. Just here to deliver another message."
Beatrice unwrapped one of the buffs inside her bag and grasped it with her fingers, before slowly bringing her hand up to her mouth in a fist, as if she was deep in contemplation. She gently pushed the buff into her mouth and ran her tongue over it, its sour taste making her cringe just a tad. "And what's that?" Beatrice replied, resting the buff against the inside of her mouth, ready to release its strength at any moment. The moon may have been but a sliver that night, but the knife that appeared in the man's left hand was an adequate substitute, for its blade shone so bright that Beatrice nearly had to shut her eyes. She bit into the buff and steadied herself as she waited for the power to flow through her. The thug regarded her with a curious expression before his mouth broke into a half-toothed smile, and he stepped forward.
"Gilbert sends his regards."
The rows of diamond rings under glass were so overwhelming at first that Beatrice had no idea where to begin. Truth be told, she had been fine with Garrett never getting around to proposing, and even the affairs, as long as they were kept relatively out of sight. But this latest transgression had been too much. Not only was Amelia Garrett's boss and thus directly in control of his future earnings, but from the few times she had met her, Beatrice had been taken aback by her domineering personality. It would only be a matter of time, she had surmised, before Amelia would either chew Garrett up and spit him out, or, and this worried her even more, she would convince Garrett into cutting Beatrice loose. And that, simply, was unacceptable. Beatrice did not need their engagement to be a gesture of Garrett's undying love for her. Far from it. She needed the engagement to send a message to Garrett that she would no longer tolerate any behavior that could jeopardize their future. It had been relatively easy, in the end, to bed the professor. Beatrice had been wrong about the green card, and that had made things much easier. She had called his office, pretending to be a reporter from an obscure trade journal. Her chemical engineering degree had provided the necessary bona fides to be convincing enough to set up a meeting at a bar near campus. Gerald had recognized her as soon as she sat down, which she knew was a possibility, and he had nearly fled before Beatrice forcefully convinced him that he should stay. Him being married to a domineering bitch had given her an easy template to follow, and she was surprised at how effective it was. It had only taken 3 more clandestine meetups before Gerald was infatuated with her, and she had brought him back to her downtown apartment for a mid-afternoon romp. As they lay together in her small bed afterward, Beatrice had contemplated revealing their significant other's treachery, But then she saw the look of shame forming on Gerald's face and knew that it wasn't necessary. A week later, Amelia had called Garrett into her office and explained that it was probably a good idea that the two of them cease their fornication, and also she would be happy to recommend Garrett for the open position at one of the other big PE shops in town. Beatrice had waited a few weeks after that to broach the subject of marriage. The interview process had gone quickly, most likely thanks to Amelia's recommendation, and Garrett was soon set up at a cushy new job with a cushy new title and, unfortunately, surrounded by a whole new group of young analysts to go after. So one afternoon she had surprised him in the office, dressed to the nines, and dragged him out to lunch nearby, where she delivered her ultimatum. Beatrice was surprised at how easily the conversation had gone, and surmised that Garrett's parents must have been getting too embarrassed up at their country club in Greenwich that their son had been dating the same woman for so long, and wouldn't it be nice to have grandkids before they were too old to run around with them? She had shuddered at the thought of producing offspring with Garrett, but she would have to deal with that eventuality later. Right now, she had a ring to select.
See anything you like?
The jeweler looked straight out of central casting, with tiny spectacles perched at the end of his nose, patchy tufts of white hair on the sides of his head, and a very pronounced slouch that made it difficult for him to look her directly in the eyes. "Just browsing for now, thanks," she said. Beatrice was not the type of woman who would spend her 20s dreaming of the ring she wanted, and after dating Garrett for so long without even a whiff that a proposal was forthcoming, she was utterly uninterested in the entire process. Nevertheless, she didn't trust Garrett not to come home with a tiny solitaire from one of the stores on Fifth Avenue, and so she had taken it upon herself to find a jeweler deep in the Diamond District where she could get a rock for the same price.
Okay, just let me know if something catches your eye.
Something did eventually catch her eye. It wasn't terribly big, and it wasn't actually a diamond. The stone was purple amethyst, if she had to guess, and was wedged between two enormous hunks of glittering carbon, almost as if it wasn't even there. The way the stone caught the light gave Beatrice pause. There was something different about this ring, and she wanted to know what. "Sir, could I take a look at that one?"
Oh, that's a recent arrival. Close to 4 carats and superb color. It's
No, not the diamond, the one next to it. The jeweler looked up from the case with a furrowed brow and frowned.
Oh, that one. Didn't realize that was still out. I'm afraid that's most likely out of your price range. No offense, ma'am.
I don't know about that. My future fiancé gave me a pretty substantial budget, and
I'm sure he did, but still the problem remains that you do not have the correct funds to purchase that particular ring. Now, if I can direct your attention to—
The word caught Beatrice off guard. Correct funds? He couldn't have been talking about tokens, could he? In her years of questing, she had met many people hawking alchemic wares in exchange for tokens, but those transactions had always occurred in the shadows. In a trash-filled alley or a back corner of a random flea market, or that one time where Beatrice waited for 7 hours under the Manhattan Bridge. This was different. This was brazen, out in the open. And that intrigued Beatrice even more. It was fortunate for her that she even had the bronze token with her that day. She normally didn't travel with any tokens, unless she had specific business to attend to. With a flourish, she flicked the token into the air. It landed after several flips onto the top of the glass case, where it wobbled a bit before finally settling down. The jeweler, his curiosity piqued, leaned over to examine it with his loupe before picking it up.
He said. Interesting.
What? Asked Beatrice. It's a bronze, but there's more where that came from.
No, not the token, which you can have back, by the way.
He put the token back down on the glass and slid it across to Beatrice, making a horrific scraping sound in the process that made her cringe.
It's you I'm talking about. I've heard whispers of a blonde alchemist whose buffs are second to none. Never thought, though, that she would come walking through my door wanting to buy a piece of shitty carbon.
What's that supposed to mean?
It means, my dear lady, that your reputation precedes you, but mine didn't. Were it not for Providence, we might never have crossed paths. Anyway, that's an issue for me to deal with some other time. For now, we must discuss the terms of your purchases.
The taste of the buff was acerbic, as if Beatrice had washed her mouth out with fetid lemon juice. She had contemplated waiting a few moments to see if maybe the thug could be reasoned with. With only one strength buff in her bag, another stupid oversight, she realized, she didn't want to waste it right out of the gate. But the enforcer had made his intentions clear when he had uttered that name. Gilbert. If you walked by him on the street, he would be the last person you'd notice, even if he was the only other person in eyeshot. He was so unassuming that he would blend in at an all-women co-working space. The man was just so ordinary. From his nondescript brown hair to his simple dress, his entire air screamed, "I'm not worth noticing." But his appearance was the only thing about him that was unremarkable. The man was, in a word, unnerving. Beatrice had only ever met him one time, but that one encounter was enough for her to know that he wasn't someone you wanted to run into alone in a back alley. It had been a short meeting, at the Green Market in Union Square. She was considering the ripeness of some green tomatoes when he had sidled up to her in his unassuming way, and it took a rather pronounced throat-clearing before she even noticed him. "Yes," she had said, turning to look at him. "Hello, Beatrice," he had replied. Hi? Do I know you?" "Not directly, no. Your reputation precedes you, though, so I wanted to come size you up myself." "I'm sorry, not sure what you mean. A silver token had appeared in between his fingers, as if he had grabbed it out of thin air. She had never seen that denomination before, as at the time she was flush with only bronze. But the gesture was obvious. This man, whoever he was, knew about the other half of her life. "Come, let's take a walk." Beatrice had put down the tomatoes and followed behind him, into the interior of Union Square. Even though they were only a stone's throw from the gaggle of hipsters perusing produce at the market, it felt like they had entered another world within the park. The few people around were all different in some way, and Beatrice suspected that if she started screaming, no one would come help her or even hear her. They had sat down on an empty bench and faced each other, and it felt like the most awkward first date Beatrice had ever been on. "Gilbert," he had said, extending his hand. Beatrice had returned the gesture, but when she had touched her palm to his, a chill suddenly ran up her arm that had nearly made her recoil in horror. "Nice to meet you, Gilbert." "No, the pleasure is all mine. I had heard rumors about a new alchemist who was churning out some interesting stuff, and, well, I make it my business to know the people who should be known. I was even able to procure a sample of your wares, and I have to say I'm impressed. Very impressed." "Thanks. Are you with the council or something? Did I do something wrong?" "No, I'm not with the council. And the answer to your second question depends on how the rest of our conversation goes. I'm curious, how did you come up with the strength buff?" "What? Oh, it was just a lot of trial and error. Sure, new alchemy always is. But you obviously found a unique source of prima materia for the strength enhancement." Beatrice had seen several steps ahead of where this conversation was headed, and had tried to put an end to it quickly. "Salamanders, in Swindler's Cove up in Inwood, but there's not many left after I finished up there, so—" I see. Well, then, if you happen to come up with any more interesting alchemic breakthroughs, I'd love to hear about them." He had grabbed her hand again suddenly, with such force that Beatrice had nearly been pulled forward onto him. His second handshake had been just as cold and clammy as the first, and when he had finally withdrawn and walked off without another word, Beatrice had breathed a sigh of relief. It was then that she had noticed the business card that was now in her hand. It was cream-colored, no different than any of the hundreds of other business cards Beatrice had received in her lifetime. Gilbert, it had said on one line, with the Guild on the line below, followed by a random P.O. box number that she had later traced to somewhere in Lower Manhattan. She had turned over the card to see a raised red sigil of what at first glance was a pigeon. But upon further inspection, she saw that it wasn't a pigeon at all. The bird had no beak, and wings that were more befitting a hawk than the lowly vermin that Beatrice had been killing over the years. She later determined it was something called an Illyrian. Only 2 of the mythical birds were said to exist at one time, laying eggs every 60 years, and after those eggs hatched, the parent Illyrians drowned themselves. It was a rather morbid and sad symbol, and Beatrice had wondered why the Guild hadn't chosen a more majestic creature to use, like the phoenix or the roc. But the answer to that question was furthest from her mind at the moment, as she steadied her footing and waited for the right moment to knock out the knife-wielding idiot in front of her with one blow. She finally felt the familiar surge of strength flowing through her as the buff went into effect. It was exhilarating, and Beatrice couldn't help but smile. "Well, let's get this over with," she said. "You just going to rob me of my effects, or is that knife intended for other purposes?"
"The latter," the enforcer said. "Nothing personal, just business."
"Oh, I don't suppose I can convince you otherwise? Because if you think I'm going to let you just stab me to death, you're going to be severely disappointed.
I just ate one of your little strength buffs, and are gonna knock me out with a single blow, eh?"
The enforcer's grin widened as Beatrice recoiled in horror.
"Oh, don't look so shocked. You didn't think there were going to be consequences to defying the Guild? Didn't think they told me exactly what you were capable of before sending me out here tonight?"
Beatrice's body began to tremble, her confidence shattered in an instant. She tried to steady herself, tried to pretend that it would all be fine, but as the seconds ticked and her strength began to ebb away, she came to the realization that she was most likely not going to walk away from this encounter alive.
"Now I can do this the easy way. A quick poke to your abdomen and I'll be off. You'll still bleed to death nice and slow on the ground, but at least you'll look pretty in the casket. Or I can slice you up real good that it'll take a few weeks before they figure out who you were. Your choice."
"Sorry, I choose option 3, she said, surging forward. It didn't matter if he knew what was coming. Even a brute like him was no match for her strength. Beatrice screamed as her eyes closed, and she felt her left fist connect cleanly with the enforcer's jaw. He hadn't even tried to block her, the big dope. But then she opened her eyes and was greeted by the enforcer's crooked smile, and her hand exploded in pain. She swung her right fist forward only for it to be blocked by the man's forearm. Before she could stagger backward to safety, he had her, his left hand lifting her body cleanly off the ground like she was a little kid. Beatrice flailed in the air, trying desperately to land a kick in the enforcer's midsection, but he just laughed as Beatrice's heels flew off her feet and hit him with a whimper.
"Hold still, girl."
The man's grip on her shoulder tightened, like she was caught in a vice, and she screamed from the pain as the arc of the knife came down toward her. She pleaded with the amethyst ring to do something to help her, to lend her its strength. But it remained silent on her finger, a worthless hunk of rock that she had sacrificed so much to obtain. Beatrice watched as the crooked blade completed its trajectory, and time seemed to slow. It was as if she was watching a movie of her own life in a darkened theater, and the director had decided to draw out this last moment as long as possible. Well, she had seen enough, and closed her eyes to wait for the life to drain out of her. Except that conclusion didn't come. Instead, Beatrice heard the impatient grunting of her would-be murderer, and she hoped beyond hope that maybe someone had come to her rescue. She wasn't that lucky, but somewhere the goddess of luck must have been smiling down on her just a little, because when she opened her eyes, the knife was not lodged in her stomach, but caught on the black sequins that coated her dress just above her thigh. The enforcer cursed in some foreign language as he tried to pull the knife free, his grip on her left shoulder loosening just a tad. Beatrice tried in vain to turn her body away so that he couldn't grab it, but he grabbed the handle with a quick thrust of his arm. Beatrice screamed as the enforcer forced the blade through her dress into her thigh and slashed downward before pulling the weapon free. He released his grip on her shoulder and she crumpled to the ground. Her hand instinctively went down to her thigh, and she felt the warm blood spilling out of her. Her eyes drifted up to the man who was now crouching over her with that same stupid smile on his face and the red-coated blade in his hand, and she braced herself for the end. The sky was blue, the water was warm, and Beatrice was drunk. It was the last day of her bachelorette, and a part of her didn't ever want to leave the sun-soaked Bahamian beach to return to the miserable February snow and to the aftermath of Garrett's likely debauchery in Las Vegas. She thought about drugging him so full of memory serum that he wouldn't even remember what transpired, but hoped that alcohol had done the job for her. She finished her third mojito and signaled to the waiter further down the beach for another. The rest of her compatriots were still passed out from the previous night's festivities, and Beatrice would have been too if she had not cranked out an extra batch of vitality buffs before the trip. As much as she appreciated the anti-hangover effects of the buff after a hard night of partying, what she really found intoxicating was the feeling of rejuvenation that came with it. It was like she was a goddess in ancient Greece, not bound by the rules of physiology that applied to the mere mortals around her. Beatrice absent-mindedly fiddled with the ring on her finger while she waited for the waiter to return. She had left her engagement ring back home for safekeeping. If this whole engagement became an intolerable disaster, it would at least provide her with some cash to live on for a year or two. No, the only ring on her finger was the amethyst ring that had cost her an even greater fortune than Garrett had spent. The jeweler had extracted a princely sum for the ring, not just in tokens, but in bags of buffs and jars full of memory and truth serum. The transaction had wiped out her existing stores and then some. It had taken Beatrice nearly 5 months to make enough of what the jeweler wanted, and when she finally delivered the last installment, he had simply handed the ring over to her with barely an explanation of what it did. "She'll lend you her strength in times of need," was all he had said, before disappearing into the back room and not returning. Beatrice had put on the ring and wasn't surprised when nothing had happened. But as the weeks passed and she still hadn't figured out the ring's secret or why the jeweler had referred to it as a she, Beatrice was beginning to suspect she had been had. Her suspicion was confirmed when she had returned to the jeweler's shop just a week before the bachelorette to find a cluck-a-wing restaurant in its place, and the neighboring shop owners having no recollection of there ever not being a cluck-a-wing there. She had half a mind of reporting the incident to the Questing Council, but had decided against it, as she had already drawn too much attention to herself. Beatrice closed her eyes and listened to the gentle lapping of the waves on the sand. She needed a new ally, and fast, to help her sort through all the questing intricacies, for 2 reasons. First, without a second quester, she was cut off from the raid board. Not that she had seen any enforcement mechanism of the 2 or more people rule for raids, but their complexity necessitated another pair of hands. She had a few promising leads working their way up the ladder she had created, and hopefully one of them would bear fruit, but that took time. And second, it was only a matter of time before she got a new tip from her source about an especially important raid. She still had no idea who this person was. One day several years ago, she had been minding her own business, looking for another seemingly pointless quest to complete, when her Q-mail inbox flashed open with one unread message. It was a short one, just a set of numbers, which Beatrice thankfully copied down because the message deleted itself after a minute. After spending hours trying to figure out what the numbers were, she finally narrowed it down to a library call number. Which was all well and good, except that there were probably over 100 libraries in the city, and if the call number wasn't in the online catalog, which she suspected it wasn't, she was looking at untold hours of work. But Beatrice was nothing if not relentless, and so, after almost a year of digging, she had finally found it, Rita von Ash's diary, and, along with it, the secret of the magic flowing through the world. That had been the catalyst that had ignited the spark of her burning desire to ascend to the top of the questing ranks, to become the best alchemist the city had ever seen. The mysterious notes continued appearing in her Q mail, leading her to more discoveries. To be honest, she resented the amount of help the notes had provided her. Sure, she would probably still be wandering around aimlessly fetching junk for lazy questers without them, but Beatrice had spent most of her adult life pulling herself up by her own bootstraps. It was part of the reason she resented Garrett, whose entire life had been one giant handout. She'd tried to make peace with it, that she deserved the comfort and stability that Garrett's money would provide her, but instead all she felt was an even bigger desire to prove herself, to not let that cushy lifestyle make her soft. That had meant late nights in her lab, days spent in dusty library archives, weeks spent trekking around the small bits of wilderness still left in the city, and, of course, that trip to Corfu, where all on her own she had found the crown jewel of her arsenal, the meadow blad. Beatrice opened her eyes, hoping to see a full mojito on the table next to her. Instead, her empty glass was gone, and in its place was a small ivory envelope set under a small rock. An envelope sealed with a wax seal, bearing a familiar sigil. Beatrice shot up from her chair and ran down the beach, hoping to catch a glimpse of whoever had left the envelope. After jogging nearly halfway back to the hotel beach bar and finding no trace of anyone, she walked slowly back to her chair. The Illyrian in the sigil glared up at her with its singular eye, and Beatrice felt her heart skip a beat. She tore open the envelope and pulled out the small piece of paper tucked inside, which was blank. Beatrice turned the paper over and found the back blank, too. She ran her fingers across both sides, trying to feel for impressions left by a pen or some other substance that had been surreptitiously applied, but there simply wasn't anything there. A shiver rippled through Beatrice's body, and she felt exposed in a way that she hadn't felt in a long time. She kicked the sand and cursed herself for being so careless. Was she that naive to really think the guild was going to just leave her alone, after she had lied to Gilbert and flouted her alchemy prowess by buying that ring? She wanted to scream, to take the ring off and toss it in the ocean and just run away. But the guild had just demonstrated that it could track her wherever she was, so what would be the point? No, she wouldn't be cowed so easily. She was Beatrice Stollard, master alchemist, and she wasn't going to let someone like Gilbert push her around. The ground was cold, and Beatrice was dying. Whatever strength still remained in her body was fleeing as fast as the blood was pouring out of the gash in her thigh, an unfortunate consequence of the misused strength buff. Even now, in her darkest hour of need, the stupid ring sat there dormant. It was her own fault, really. She should have forced the jeweler to explain the inner workings of her purchase. After all, who buys a $500,000 piece of factory equipment and doesn't make sure it comes with an instruction manual? What was she supposed to do? Ask the ring for help as if it were a real person? That would be a start, yes, said a voice. Beatrice opened her eyes to see the boots of the enforcer turned away from her, but the pain was too great to look any further for the source of the new voice. She shut her eyes again and concentrated on a thought. "Who said that?" said Beatrice in her mind. "I did," said the same voice. It was a woman's voice. That much Beatrice concluded, but the words were laced with an unplaceable accent. Who are you?" she asked. A flicker of light appeared in the back corner of Beatrice's mind. It was purple, the same color as the stone. The flicker slowly gained shape until Beatrice could make out the faint figure of a woman. I am nobody. Well, I was somebody once. That was a long time ago, though. Now, I am nothing more than an essence distilled into a rock, perched upon the finger of a woman who is about to die. I don't understand, thought Beatrice. How can you be as much as I would love to have this conversation right now? If I do not lend you my strength, that very large man standing above you will begin slicing you open and letting your insides drain out of you. Oh, thought Beatrice, then please lend me your strength. That's it, said the voice. No, that is not sufficient. I have been trapped in here a long time, and I am not going to give you my power simply because you said, please. What then? Said Beatrice. She felt the anger building inside her, and her head began to spin, a haze beginning to envelop the internal world in her mind. Beatrice tried to suppress it, tried to return to the stoic frame she maintained day in and day out, but she couldn't. Instead, she unleashed the torrent of rage that she had been holding back for so long. You want me to beg like a dog? To plead on my knees for you to save me, is that it? I didn't kowtow to Gilbert or his brood or anyone else in my life, and I'm certainly not about to do so to an incorporeal voice in my head. So either give me your strength, or let me just die already. The figure in her mind crystallized for just a moment, and Beatrice could barely see the face of the woman. Her eyes shone with the same color as the ring, and her mouth curled upwards in a smile. Gladly. Beatrice felt her right hand begin to tremble, and she opened her eyes to see the amethyst stone glowing softly. The light continued to brighten, and she felt a surge of power pour into her body. It was similar to the strength buff, but only as a tabby and a lion are both technically cats. This was raw, undistilled power, not the pale imitation that Beatrice had created in her lab. As strength poured out of the ring, so too did the purple glow. It spread over her like a protective shield, and Beatrice finally pushed herself up from the ground. She held her hands in front of her, and they shimmered with the purple aura of her mysterious benefactor. The enforcer turned around to face her once again. You're still alive. He stared at the light enveloping her, a look of confusion on his face. What's this about, then? You eat another one of your little candies? Beatrice smiled, the wound in her thigh nothing but a pinprick. No. Oh, he said, pointing the blood-stained knife toward her. Then it shouldn't take long to finish. She shook her head. I don't think so. The brute laughed. We already went through this song and dance. Now, if you don't mind, just let me kill you so I can get on with my evening. He lunged forward clumsily with the blade, but Beatrice was ready. She caught his knife-wielding hand with her own and dug her fingers into his wrist like she was squeezing a tomato. The enforcer screamed, dropping the knife to the ground and trying to wrest his hand free, but Beatrice wouldn't let him. She tightened her grip, heard the crunch of bones breaking, and saw the man's hand go limp. Now it was the brute who was cowering with fear. Please, the enforcer said. Can't you just what? Asked Beatrice. Let you go? After what you were going to do to me with this? She bent down to pick up the knife and pointed it at him, her outstretched arm gleaming with power. The man's body began to tremble as he nodded slowly, and Beatrice relished the role reversal. She felt invincible, unstoppable, unbreakable. Still, the nagging pain at her side was slowly returning, and she looked down briefly to see blood seeping down her leg, a minor inconvenience that she would deal with shortly. Sure, but I want you to deliver a message for me to your boss. Anything, said the enforcer, practically whimpering. You tell him
that Beatrice Taylor is under nobody's thumb." She reversed her grip on the knife, stepped forward, and smashed the handle into the man's neck with all of her strength. The enforcer collapsed onto the ground, and Beatrice tossed the knife at his crumpled form before turning and walking away. She only made it another 20 feet before the purple aura suddenly evaporated, and with it, Beatrice's consciousness. The room was white. White walls, white sheets, white drapes, and a white tray of food perched on a stand next to Beatrice's bed. She stared at the unappetizing cup of Jell-O and the small carton of juice and frowned, before shooting pain erupted along her thigh. The door opened in that moment, and in walked Garrett. "Bea, you're awake!" Beatrice looked at her husband with a blank expression, trying to recall how it was that she ended up in a hospital room overlooking Central Park. Her head hurt, which was odd, because she could have sworn the reason she was in the hospital had something to do with the throbbing on her thigh. Then, like the morning fog on the water burning off from the rays of the rising sun, it all came back to her. The dinner, the walk in the park, the ambush, and the ring. "You're late," she said matter-of-factly. "I waited for you at dinner and you never showed." "What are you talking about?" said Garrett. "I waited for you at dinner and you never showed." "No, I was at Joel Daniels for over an hour and you were definitely not there." "What? Why did you go there? You changed the reservation to Café des Arts last week, remember? You texted me that you were able to get a table off the wait list." "I most certainly did not. Why the hell would you think I—" Oh. The events of the evening suddenly all snapped into place. This second reservation, the blocked-off roads, it had all been a setup so Beatrice could walk right into the trap that Gilbert had sprung for her. "Sorry," she said. "I must have forgotten. What time am I getting discharged?" Garrett looked at her like she was an insane person. "Bea, do you not realize? You've been in a coma for a week. The doctor said it was lucky that the jogger found you when he did, otherwise you might have bled out." "Oh. Well, lucky for me then, I guess. What about the guy who did this to me? He locked up somewhere?" "Not exactly," said Garrett, who lowered his eyes toward the floor. "What?" she asked. "Well, he's dead. Paramedics found him close to where you had collapsed. A knife wedged into his abdomen." Beatrice's eyes widened. She hadn't done that, had she? "It's okay. I already talked to the police days ago. They're not going to charge you. Obviously, it was self-defense. They just want to talk to you when you're up for it. I think they want to know how a 5'0" like you managed to take out a guy 4 times your size." "No, I mean, I didn't hit—" Before she could finish the thought, Garrett had wrapped his arms gingerly around her and began stroking her back, which made her almost want to vomit. "It's all right. Everything's going to be okay. I'm just glad that you're awake. I thought I had lost you." Garrett began to sob into Beatrice's shoulder, and she found herself comforting him, which was odd, given the circumstances. Her body was still too weak to return the hug, so all she could do was rest her chin on his head. "Sorry, didn't mean to. Just need to get some fresh air. I'll be right back." Garrett quickly stood up from the bed and walked out of the room, leaving Beatrice alone once again. Not wanting to deal with the mental fallout of having killed yet another person, Beatrice closed her eyes and tried to fall back asleep. It didn't work. She eventually heard footsteps approach her bedside and quickly retreat. The orderly, she suspected, clearing her uneaten food. Except when she opened her eyes a crack a few minutes later, the tray of food was still there, along with a small ivory envelope sealed with a wax sigil. Beatrice jolted upright and grabbed the envelope, sending another stab of pain through her body. She ignored it and broke open the seal to reveal a piece of paper with a short message written in blood-red ink. Message received.
Best regards, Gilbert. Guild of Tokens, Enforcer, was written by John Auerbach and read by Tavia Gilbert. Editing and post-production by Emily Stewart.